Okay, so there we are. We've got more people now, so we're going to make a start. And I'm going to say very nice things about Hector, who came
Lovely.
to um, the Northern France branch when it was Northwest France and the Channel Islands. And we were doing better in those days. It must have been the name change that did us in. And he's been an absolute tonic, really, because he's done all sorts of things in the branch. He's got stuff together about youth policy. He's got meetings together in Paris universities and got together people from the universities to get other meetings together. And he's now become our youth officer. So he's just gone from strength to strength since joining us. And he's at the Sorbonne University in Paris, which I would have thought would have taken that much most of his time, but hasn't. Thankfully, he's had a bit left to spare with us, and he's made links with the Americas,
Yeah,
Americas University, the University of London, and he's been giving talks at these other universities in Paris. And he's the only person in Northern France who's doing anything about the Northern France branch, I think. Um,
lovely.
he's doing very well at it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hector to talk to
Okay.
us about the politics of compassion, which we could probably do with a bit of, if you
Yeah.
ask me, a bit
All right.
more. Over
Thank
to
you very
you.
much for those kind words. And
Absolutely.
thank you everyone for being here. And I guess we should just start cracking. I apologize first of all. There may be a lot of dates and a lot of terms because like I study history. And so first and foremost, it'll be quite date based and quite chronological, but it should give you an overview of how compassion in politics has changed, starting in the medieval period up until the modern day. And so we'll be looking at this notion in a historico-political sense, taking us from Latin Europe up until the present day and via the modern period and, of course, the 20th century. First and foremost, I think it's really important we define the word compassion. So compassion comes from the Latin term compati, which references the idea of suffering with and can be extended in a modern sense, the idea of having mercy, grace, sympathy, and perhaps even pity. For this discussion, I'll focus much more on the Western world, which I think is also important to define, as there's often different views of what the West encompasses. So in this demonstration, I'll define the West in a historical sense. So it stems from the Latin word occidens, first used in 1586.
Mm.
And so the Western world is the heritor of Latin Christendom. And whilst it first and foremost refers to Europe, we'll extend it with its modern usage to countries such as Australia, the United States, New Zealand being part and parcel of the West. And so today I'll be looking at the notion of compassion in a chronological timeline, which will take us from the feudal period of the Western world, particularly in France and Britain. Then we'll plunge into the matrix of the French Revolution in 1789 and look at perhaps more subtle forms of compassion in the National Health Service post the Second World War. And of course, we'll also discuss the present world, which should set the base for a very interesting discussion, which I think we can define as a moment of anti-compassion, where we see self-centered politics, isolationism, and the decline of the international order. And in fact, I think President Trump represents the summit of this anti-compassion and the complete denial of the rules-based post-1945 world order. And so therefore, our guiding sort of question for this discussion today will be, can we save the West's humanity? And we'll look at it in three distinct parts, and then we'll end with a case study on Britain. First of all, we'll look at the matrix of early Western morality in medieval Europe. Then we'll look at the renewal of compassion and morality through legislation and emancipation. And finally, we'll look at the notion of compassion being both reaffirmed in the 21st century, but also profoundly questioned. And so unless there's any questions so far, I'd like to start with a brief overview of medieval Europe, as I think it's often a period that's often covered in doubt and often overlooked. We often view the medieval period as sort of a summit of violence, cultural stagnation, but in reality, quite the opposite is true. It's a period of profound rupture and change in our European world, and it's the basis for modern Western political philosophy, and also the basis of essentially our modern world. And so the medieval period is first and foremost a moment of immense demographic change. And so we see the rise of a new form of elite and so-called topographical changes in the way which European geography and the environment is structured. And so we see the emergence of villages, towns, cities in a process defined by the Italian historian as a process of incastalmento, which means that you have the creation of structures such as castles, which then leads to the creation of villages. We also see in the medieval world the rise of education as a modern philosophy, with universities in Salamanca in 1218, Oxford in 1243, Bologna in 1088, and of course Sorbonne, my own university, founded in 1215. It's also a period of immense cultural exchange and new horizons for the Western world. This can be seen most notably in the case of Sicily in 1130, where the Norman king Roger II actually combines different cultures in Sicily, which leads to a mixture of Byzantine, so Eastern Roman administration, Fatimid with certain Islamic cultures, and of course Latin administration. And so this proves to show us that even in the darkest times of European domination, there's still this kind of interaction between different groups, different societies, different cultures. And so the medieval ideals is first of all, the medieval ideal of compassion, is first of all based and stems from Christian theology in Europe, which seeks to define the role of compassion in society and seeks to illustrate compassion as a basis for social concord and harmony. This can be seen in a few writings of the period, such as that of Thomas Aquinas, the famous theological thinker, who in his book describes compassion as a virtue relating to the extension of divine love to one's own neighbor. And we can see this in so-called communal experiences in the medieval world, where we have structures that start to exist, hospitals, etc. And this can also be seen in the writings of a second author, which is Augustine of Hippo, who therefore defines Christian charity as a construction against the ideas of Roman civic glory, and therefore it is compassion for Augustine of Hippo that plays the role of a moderator between power, domination, people, and of course government. The medieval period is also defined as a period of institutionalization. This can be seen with the creation of parliaments and legal systems, with the Magna Carta in 1215. It's also a period, more importantly, where there's a new institution which gains significant ground, and that is the church. And so the church becomes this sort of omnipresent power in the medieval world and medieval society, particularly with the creation of different religious orders, Dominicans, Franciscans, Benedictines, and it is the Order of St. Benedict, which I think is quite interesting to look at, as it shows the notion of helping the poor, the notion of charity, the notion of compassion. And so I would like to read very quickly an extract of the Rule of St. Benedict, which is this foundational book which the Benedictines followed to the line. And the first line reads, "You must relieve the lot of the poor, clothe the naked, visit the sick, and bury the dead. Go to help the troubled, console the sorrowing, and your way of acting should be different from the world's way. The love of Christ must become before, else you are not to act in anger or to nurse a grudge." Now, religion is also important, not just the religious sense, but of course in a social fashion. And so the first hospitals in Europe are actually found in the 11th century, particularly in Paris, with the Hôtel Dieu, so that's hotel, and then Dieu, D-I-E-U, which is founded in the 11th century. And so the first hospitals in the medieval world are actually founded by this religious notion of compassion, not by the state. In this last part of this first demonstration of the medieval world and the notion of compassion, I think it's also important to nuance that compassion is not generalized in the medieval period. In fact, The medieval world is also defined by an almost Russian doll style of classes and categorization of individuals. And so the society is compassionate, yes, but it's first and foremost defined by rank. And so the medieval society is defined by three classes, which is a very important structure, which we see often in history, both in the Islamic world, the Western world, but also in other societies. So the three classes are the bellatores, those who fight, the oratores, those who pray, and the laboratores, those who work. And so it's very important to understand the fact in the medieval world, the notion of charity is defined by duty and not by right. Therefore, there's no notion of social protection, there's no social net. You are purely reliant on the charity of the common man. And also, it is the medieval society that's actually the basis of Elizabethan notions of compassion and the idea of the deserving and undeserving poor, which therefore creates deep social rifts. And so, to resume the medieval period before we enter the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, I'd like to cite the French historian Jacques Le Goff, who says that although compassion does exist in the medieval world, it's highly hierarchical and first and foremost punitive. Are there any questions so far, or should I continue?
No, I think it's building up a picture of the foundation where it provides foundations
All
for
right.
fairly modern politics, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and welfare and
Exactly.
attitudes towards welfareism.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's
Okay.
very interesting. Go
All
on.
right. Okay. And so the 18th century is a century of vast change in Europe. Of course, we have the Industrial Revolution with the steam engine in 1767, as well as a period of profound intellectual changes with the French Enlightenment movement, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Diderot, Montesquieu, all these philosophers who arrive and who instill these new ideals in Europe. And so it's a moment of essential change where the old world, synonymous with elitism and the feudal system, is put into question, and a new system emerges, one based off universality and singularity, not rigidity. And so the Enlightenment movement in the 17th century instills first and foremost an essential idea, which is that the individual is not just an individual, but a moral agent. And therefore, that individual requires respect and, in times of need, compassion. And so, in Jean Jacques Rousseau, the famous French philosopher's first book in 1762, he sees compassion as a natural instinct and something which is central to both moral, societal, and political development. Even the famous capitalist Adam Smith, in his book The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, describes sympathy and empathy and compassion as a foundation for social order. And therefore, this represents a massive shift in both the mindset of how the individual is perceived in society, and therefore how we should treat one another, and we should treat one another, therefore, with a form of compassion. The French Revolution is what really crystallizes these ideas into law. And I mean, I think it's important to also understand that the French Revolution happens over a long period of time. It's not just 1789, but 1789 is, of course, when the Bastille, the prison in Paris, is stormed, and that marks the beginning of the revolution. And so the French revolutionaries, led by Robespierre, Danton, all these individuals, they form a constitution, the DDHC, so the Rights of Man and the Citizen, in 1789. And this is the first legal document which defines the individual as free, equal, and sovereign. And therefore, compassion is no longer a religious duty, but really is instilled in law and, of course, in politics based on one principle, which is the notion of universal human worth. And so I'd like to first read an extract translated from French into English of the first article of the French Constitution of 1789, which states that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and therefore social distinctions may only be based on the considerations of the common good. So there's this emergence of the idea of compassion, the common good, sharing, and the collective, which is both not just societal, but also legal in France and more broadly in Europe from 1789, as of course the French legal system under Napoleon is expanded towards Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, etc., etc. And so it's actually an English historian called Lynn Hunt in her book Inventing Human Rights in 2007 that argues that compassion becomes universalized post 1789 with a new culture of empathy that emerges. Now, this new culture of empathy and compassion is, yes, legalized, but it emerges in something perhaps more soft and more cultural, and that's actually through books. And so, books and novels is what actually instills morality in the common individual based on education. And so, one of the most, key sort of pieces of this new literature that emerged in the 19th century is, of course, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. And the figure of Oliver Twist is actually analyzed a lot by historians, particularly in the United States, by a historian called Robert L. Patton at Johns Hopkins University, who therefore describes Oliver's situation, losing his source of absolute compassion, his mother, and therefore, with the reader being confronted with the cruel world around Oliver, we start to develop a sense of compassion for Oliver and the sort of young Mr. Twist. Now, of course, moving into the 20th century, the 20th century is marked a bit like the 19th century by war and conflict, but therefore it is almost this war and this conflict that actually leads to the emergence of the first compassionate states. And we can see this particularly during the Second World War with the Beveridge Report in 1942, which becomes the basis for the massive social changes that take place under the Labour government of Clement Attlee. And of course, this leads to the creation of the National Health Service, the brainchild of the Welsh Health Secretary, Aneurin Bevan, in 1945. And Bevan defines, in an almost literary sense, 5 giants to be defeated by the state in this new state of compassion, which emerges post the Second World War. Those are want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. And therefore, he proposes a compassionate universal state which encompasses healthcare, social insurance, and of course, public education, the foundations of the modern welfare state. And so this is also defined in a sociological sense as quite a radical moment, where we see in the society post 1945 a change where compassion becomes not only legislated, but also publicly supported. And so the American sociologist T.H. Marshall, in his book Citizenship and Social Class in 1970, describes the emergence of a social citizenship, which means the modern citizen post-1945 therefore believes that the state must cover certain important sort of functions, such as access to healthcare, pensions, education, etc. And then post-1945, there was also not just compassion and the legislation of a political system which encourages compassion on a national sense, but also at an international scale, with, of course, the United Nations, the UN Charter in 1945. The preamble, I think, is crystal clear in that sense when it says, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in the fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person." And so it's the UN Declaration of 1948 that also continues on this principle and states that all human beings are born free and equal in rights. And this is the first attempt to create a global moral framework as described by the English historian Mary Ann Glendon in her book A World Made New, published in 2001. And therefore, there's kind of this idea that the UN Declaration of Human Rights reinvents compassion as a political principle, not just solidarity on a national scale, but also in a global sense. And so this is also the globalization of so-called Western moral expectations, something which can definitely be put into question, since which is a world order based on rules, rights, and shared responsibilities. And so this can be seen more concretely by specific actions of certain governments, such as by that of the Republican president Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1961, who creates USAID, so the Food Aid Program, and internationalizing the UN idea of world food, and how, of course, being compassionate doesn't just mean creating these institutions, it means creating a network which helps developing countries and, of course, assists those most in need. And so, in this last part, before looking a bit more at the UK, it's important to note that post 1979, there is the rise of the notion of individualism and, of course, the demise of the rules based world order. And so, post 1945, we can therefore see the emergence of an anti compassion, which can be defined under neoliberal economics. And so, this is associated with Thatcher, Reagan, and of course, global institutions which seek to redefine society around efficiency, competition, individual responsibility, therefore slowly eroding and breaking down that notion of compassion. And of course, Thatcher, who breaks in a paradigm shift with the Cold War consensus on the welfare state from Attlee to Callaghan, and of course supported by conservative figures such as Howard Macmillan. And so Thatcherism marks a paradigm shift where the welfare state is no longer supported and, of course, profoundly put into question. And I think that the best way to illustrate this would be to read an extract of an interview made by Mrs. Thatcher in 1987 with the Women's Society when questioned on her views on the welfare state. She has said, "I think we have gone through a period where too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it is the government's job to cope with it, or I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it." So they're casting their problems on society, and who is society? And Miss Thatcher ends by saying there is no such thing. Therefore, it is the emergence of this kind of cruel politics which seeks to slowly but surely dismantle the welfare state. And in the book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism by the English historian David Harvey in 2005, he argues that Thatcherism replaces social duty with market logic, therefore turning the government into a business-like model with margins and profit, replacing compassion with capital, and from the worship of welfare to the worship simply of just wealth. And so a second point, post-1945, is of course the question of immigration. And immigration particularly marks the rise of anti-compassion and becomes a test of Western compassion, particularly post-1990, 9/11. It's become a focal point for right-wing conservatism, particularly in a time where the United Nations is more and more fragile. And so for this example, I'd like to look at at a more specific case, which is that of Australia. And so particularly under the Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, from 1996 to 2007, John Howard is actually the first politician to coin the so-called term illegal immigrant and to rebrand the migrant as illegal. And so in a very interesting article by an Australian historian called Michael Klein, entitled "The Use of Exclusionary Language to Manipulate Opinion, John Howard and Asylum Seekers," John Howard actually weaponizes the asylum seeker and seeks to use the term queue jumpers, playing on the ideals of Australian fairness, as well as the introduction of the term illegal, which seeks to portray the immigrant or asylum seeker as a rule breaker, or by definition, a de facto criminal. But we can also see in the same time, post-2007, the emergence of compassionate approaches to immigration, with the example of Angela Merkel and the defining moment of her chancellorship during the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis, where instead of sort of reverting to that sort of harsh right-wing language, she used her famous line, excuse my German, "Wir dürfen das," which means "we can manage this," which seeks to focus away from the notion of crisis and instead focus on welcoming and being compassionate and, of course, helping those in need. And so she used restraint and reason to encourage compassion, to encourage dialogue, consensus, and defend her policies as rational and logical, not radical or decisive. And then finally, in this last part, I think one politician who illustrates compassion on a very clear scale is, of course, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, who became a beacon of compassion, particularly post 2019, after the horrendous Christchurch mosque shootings, where there's a very famous image of Jacinda Ardern going around the world, which I can try and share afterwards, where she's seen hugging sort of the Muslim community in Christchurch, reckoning from this horrifying attack in 2019. And so to end, I think that there is definitely room for compassion in politics in the modern world. It's definitely been changed. I mean, we've seen pushes towards more of it in the UK. I think particularly post 2024 with the lifting of the two-child benefit cap, those are all sort of moves. Free breakfast clubs, they're all small moves, but they are moves which do seek to push back towards a sense of compassion. To try and kind of deal with this new world where we have to balance those who wish to have market logic in brackets, but of course, how do we also retain the sense of compassion that was instilled in our society through politics and through legislation post 1945? And so, to conclude on this sort of brief overview of compassion since the medieval world, we can say that it's been a vector for politics from the medieval period up until the 21st century. It has therefore stood the test of time, but it's also evolved from the medieval notions of charity, the heritage of Latin Christendom, to legislation, emancipation, compassion, and of course the globalization of compassion post the horrors of the First and Second World War. However, it's very important to recognize that compassion is never a given, and therefore it's a constant battle which needs to be defended in our politics and by our politicians. And therefore, it's important to really focus on how we can, reintroduce this into our politics. And so to answer the question, which was asked very briefly in my introduction, can we save the West's humanity? I surely think we can, and we certainly can do. But in order to do so, it's important to restore the forms of compassionate leadership we saw post 1945. I hope that was all right, and it'd be good to have a discussion and some questions.
Superb.
That's right. Any questions or talking points?
One quick one to start with. You explained very well, the various different phases of these things where you had, religion, primarily Christianity at the beginning for us, leading into some concept of there being natural law, which was really probably just an absorption of the Christianity that Europe had at the time. And then leading to now where kind of there's an open debate. Do you think there's any such thing as natural law? Or is it a constant battle between different value groups and groups with their own personal interests?
I think that's a very fair question, to be honest. I think, yeah, that's definitely a very, is there a sense of natural law? I would say there's certainly basic principles, which I think we can all agree on, in my opinion. But I think it's how we get there that becomes the topic of debate, in the sense that there are these principles which throughout history have been defended and protected. Even in, if you look at even Roman society, there was actually quite an interesting system where the poor didn't pay taxes, then they didn't go to war and they didn't fight, whereas the wealthy paid taxes, but then were less likely to go to war. So I think there's this constant battle, I guess, throughout history of maintaining that kind of balance between what people want, but also keeping those values aligned, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, we had that as well. If you go back to like 1600s, 1700s in England,
Yeah,
you didn't pay tax. You were owned by the landowner.
yeah, of course, yeah.
side of it was that you had to go and fight his wars when he had them.
Yeah,
So we had the same sort of thing, but we moved away from that.
yeah.
But I'm just wondering, was that more of a power thing? So that the landowner was still in power? It wasn't really anything to do with passion. It was simply an ownership. Um, and where I started off in this was basically thinking, is it really just that we are constantly battling against this? You look at the United States, which has a very, very different view from us of what
Yeah,
compassion,
of
uh,
course.
and there are probably other areas of the world which I don't know much about where that's going to be the case as well.
Yeah,
So it suggests maybe to me that it's just a
yeah.
constant battle that you have to fight for, if you like, the
No,
more compassionate, progressive side.
yeah, no. I would agree. Definitely, I would agree that there's always a constant battle. But there's also different moments in history where different states have shown what compassion can be. Particularly in America, if you look at America post 1929, the New Deal, with Roosevelt and his Social Security Act in 1935. Those are moments where America has also shown their vision of what compassion is on the world stage. And so I think that, like, yeah, it definitely is a constant battle, but it's a battle which I would say is definitely worth fighting for. And it's a tough climb. Yes,
I
someone's raising
and
their
I'll ask you a
hand.
question.
Yeah. Yes, Tim. I want to think,
Mm.
can they hear me? Or maybe not. Or Richard, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yes, I can. First of all, I'd like to apologise because I've arrived late in this meeting. I've
That's all
missed
right.
your presentation.
That's totally fine.
I had taken one.
Valerie,
I had taken one or two notes,
Yeah.
and I was interested. Maybe you.
I'm very sorry. We don't have any. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh,
I'll come back if somebody else wishes to speak. I can hear Valerie at the same
Yeah, I
time.
can hear as well. Yeah. I think it's.
Well, shall I carry on?
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Okay, but I wanted to bring up something I found interesting with compassion was from the Old Testament of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the release of debt every 7 years.
Yeah.
And in Judaism and the freeing of slaves, which existed at that time, and then I thought, well, that goes back an awful long way, but we've still got something that harps back to this in British society with Monday money, which is given out every year. Originally meant for the poor,
Yeah.
coins for the poor from the monarch, and even in medieval Britain, the monarch would actually wash the feet of the poor
Yeah.
as well in imitating the scene of Christ washing feet.
Yeah. Of course, yeah.
But it's rather I was going to say it's a bit steep. Someone giving out Monday money with such vast wealth in Britain. It's almost a provocation, I think.
Yeah.
That was a point I was going to make, but again, I'm sorry I missed.
No, I think it's an interesting point. I think it's a very interesting point, and it is certainly a form of provocation. I would agree. Like, it's definitely, and if you look at how British, if you look at British society, how we've gone from a very strict feudal system, and you see the effects of the class system in Britain still today, it shows there's still a long way to go in terms of removing those barriers to opportunity. I would say that those points are very valid. Definitely. I think that, although we may have changed from our medieval feudal system, there is kind of the remnants. I mean, even if you look at just, like the land in London, if you look at who owns most of Westminster, there is still that kind of the feudal system in some ways still hasn't fully disappeared.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which
I
is
mean,
definitely
it actually hasn't disappeared at all. I mean, when you think of how much land and rights the royalty own now,
of course.
it's just
Yeah,
crazy.
of course, yeah. It's crazy. Yeah.
Go on.
No, please continue.
No, I was just going to say that this hierarchical tier system
Yeah.
has obviously prevailed throughout all these different periods of history we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And it's prevailed in different ways.
Yeah, of course.
And in different forms, but it's there and it's got different names.
Yeah.
And I can't see quite how that's reconcilable with most of the kind of expressions of compassion that have been charted as we've gone through this. I mean, I agree with what you say. I'm not saying you've got it wrong. I'm just saying that they're not reconcilable. There's no way in which we've kind of compassion's ever sort of really won and come out on top. Or do you think it has?
I think it's an interesting point. I think that obviously, like, society's very much changed from the medieval period to now, and that although that those class structures have remained, there has been sort of a difference in terms of how the structures are. If you look at, say, I mean, in the medieval world, obviously those classes are defined by jobs and less so by wealth. So, you know, those who, you know, there's the class who prays, which is mainly the priest, the church. There's those that work who are in the fields, and then those who fight. I think that although, yeah, I mean, you know, they are definitely hard to reconcile. But I do think we have perhaps slowly managed to do so.
I mean, in France, for example, where you and I live, and
Yeah.
where Mary lives, and Richard and Tim and Valerie, I
Yeah.
mean, we still have a system here that for all the welfarism that cuts across, there's all these intersecting lines. The welfare cuts across all these different lines, yeah? But it's still trumped really by family in France, I think. It's
In what way?
still, yeah, by family, Napoleonic lines of blood
Yeah.
are really important when it comes to inheritance, when it comes to anything. It's not rights of the individual so much as familial rights.
In what way?
Well, just that
Inheritance laws.
you have to, that you can't actually leave your money to whom you want to, as you would if you had rights as an individual. You have to pass it through all your children. And I don't know that it matters terribly much whether your children have ever had anything to do with you. You know, they just
That's true.
have to.
Yeah.
And I mean, where I used to live in the Dordogne, there used to be a lady lived near to me who really was, I was going to say, not looking forward to dying. I guess none of us are very much. But she didn't want, she knew that all her things that she worked so hard for were going to be inherited by her daughter, who she didn't think deserved any of them. So
Right. Okay. Right.
there's a lot of stuff about rights and that kind of conflict, I think, with rights of the individual.
And linger on.
I can't leave my property to whom I want to. I can now because I paid €11,000 to have everything transferred into my name. So it absolutely, and all the money came from me, and I proved it. And therefore nobody can challenge that.
Of course, yeah.
But it's just family, you know, dictates rather than equality or service.
Of course. Yeah, of course. But I would say that, like, in some ways, so like the legal system, particularly in France, has become more compassionate over time. Even if those steps are gradual, it definitely has. In the sense that, you know, like on certain issues, there has been quite a stark evolution since, say, 1789 compared to now. You know, on family matters, perhaps not. But on other issues, there has been definitely a sort of more compassionate approach. I mean, like the French were using the guillotine up until 1985, and that's thankfully been abolished.
Yeah.
But if you look at, say, 1789, there was the French Revolution. Then Napoleon takes power in 1789 to 1813. France, then in 1832, France starts to abolish what's called cruel punishment. So lashing, whipping of those who commit crimes is removed from the French system in 1832. Then, if you look at the kind of mid-19th century, there is a societal shift in the sense that the individual becomes far more sensitive to stuff like blood. And so from mid the 19th century in France, the death penalty is no longer public. It becomes at 2 a.m. behind closed doors. And then it's abolished in the late 70s, early 80s. And so I think if you look at that case of just the legal punitive system in France, that does show an evolution of how we become more sensitive and more compassionate as individuals, which has changed the judicial response to certain things, if that answers your question a little bit.
Okay, yeah, that's reasonable. Yeah.
I
still think that France has got issues there, but let's go over to Tim and Valerie.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hector. I think we have problems. We're actually using a phone, the orange phone, as our because
bandwidth.
We have no internet until June the 8th. So we use
right.
So it may go in and out.
That's all right. No worries.
I'm interested in, well, it's partly because of what I'm reading and because of the geopolitics of the period now that we're living in. What about compassion for other cultures and people? Because I don't see any compassion for other people. I've read many books on the destruction of Africa and its people, the destruction of the Arab world, the Crusades, which were determined to dominate with Christian religion in the Muslim countries, for example. So this compassion that you're talking about is a philosophical positioning for the West, essentially, is it?
I would say not necessarily. I would say that the West has definitely misused it, for sure. And the West has definitely been very anti-compassionate in certain cases, as you mentioned, in Africa, in the Middle East. But there's definitely examples of other cultures which have been far more compassionate than what perhaps has happened in the West.
Absolutely. But they're denied it by the Shia are an extremely compassionate people who believe in nature, God, and people coming together as societies to be beneficent to all. But you would not know that from the way in which we are told about Shia daily on the Western news.
Of course, yeah. No, of course. No, definitely. I think it's a very interesting point you've made, that there is definitely a lack of there's a lack of compassion, or perhaps a lack of understanding, I think, from the West in its approach to other countries and definitely other cultures.
It's an unwillingness to understand, actually. It's an unwillingness to understand.
I think it's an unwillingness, but there's also definitely a sort of a cultural confrontation, particularly in history. The example of, say, when the Spanish and the Portuguese arrived in South America. That's quite an interesting example of sort of a cultural confrontation and a shock between what was perceived as moral in Europe at the time and what was perceived as moral in, say, South America at the time. Which definitely is quite an interesting it's quite an interesting approach, and it was a discussion back in the period. If you look at, if you've heard of Las Casas, who was the Spanish priest, there's the famous the Valladolid. I'll put it in the chat if it's easier. The controversy of Valladolid, I believe it's between 1650 and 1651. It's when you have two priests. You have one priest who is from the Aristotle school of thought, and one who was a Spanish conquistador. And it's about, okay, how do we treat the Native Americans? And the conquistador called Sepulveda, in his view, we should be quote unquote compassionate, and therefore actually encourages violence. But then on the other side, you have Ascasas. I'll also put it in the chat; it's probably easier. Who harks back to Greek philosophy and says no, compassion is actually universal, and because the Native Americans are by nature human, we should be compassionate by definition, and we shouldn't define our compassion based off cultural differences. I think like the questions you raised are very interesting because there's definitely a debate which happened on and on throughout history, particularly in that sort of confrontation of cultures in that early colonial period.
Can I chime in and continue this theme from a slightly different angle?
Yeah, of course.
I think I'm hugely appreciative of your daring in crossing boundaries between different, if you like, not just between different cultures, but between different, what you might call categories of thinking about social relations and culture.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, it's really exciting to be able to consider these things. The first, when you began, the first thing it gave rise to me is that it opened up a debate that used to take place among my extended family, the two sides of my two parents' families,
right,
in New England, in the US,
right,
both of whom were Protestants.
Yeah.
Right. But one side of the family they were Methodists, so they were Lutherans.
Yeah.
And the other side were Congregationalists, so they were Calvinists.
Yeah. Okay.
And for the Lutherans, on my mother's side, compassion meant something because it was connected with notions of empathy.
Yeah.
Were for their understanding of a Lutheran understanding in that tradition of not just theology, but the practice of the Christian community and religious leaders, the encouragement of people to have empathy with others.
Yeah.
And compassion then is sort of something that arises not as it does with Thomas Aquinas or among certain philosophers as a general category. You see what I mean in a philosophical discourse, but it arises out of
individuals,
a particular kind of reading of the interpersonal psychology of the faithful in a certain view of Christianity.
Yeah.
Whereas for the Calvinists on the other side of my family, it had no meaning. They didn't understand. Compassion wasn't the term they used.
Yeah.
And even less empathy.
Yeah, of course.
Because their idea, both the Lutherans and the Calvinists had, compared to the Catholic tradition, a more radically individualist notion of not only reading the scriptures, but of faith and relation to divinity and so on. So, but for the Calvinists, religious relations were grounded much more in notions of duty.
Yeah, of course.
I think, and the idea that your duty was, to live life, that it was in a way sort of predestined for you.
Yeah.
And that was much, and that, you can see in Greek philosophy, a Stoic tradition, for example, relates much more to the Calvinists. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
And you can find aspects of like Greek drama which relate more to the empathy. So I think this. So what this makes me think of in the first instance is there's these, what you could call the history of psychological and interpersonal dispositions. Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah. And then I was going back to my family history. When my parents moved from Vermont to Massachusetts, we started living in communities where the majority of people were raised, also Christians, as Catholics.
Of course, yeah.
And among Catholics, there's a much more direct line to Aquinas.
Of course,
not only that, there is a sense that, and I think we see this very much we appreciate it living in France, of the social aspect of religious community and of all, and Valerie referenced family, but and how and Frankie talks about how family law is the norm in France, or inheritance law and so on.
Yeah.
But so my question is really about the relationship, how you see the different things that affect across different periods of history and different cultures, the relationship between these different tropes, you could say, of psychosocial relations, the psychological dimension, and the different notions of the kind of community one's in. Because like some people might say, if you start to go into the norms, I won't go on, but if you start to go into the norms of compassion, the social norms of compassion, well, one root in the Christian traditions is charity, isn't it?
Of course, yeah.
And charity means one thing when you're talking about a community where people have different degrees of means of living, don't they? Different security.
Of course.
But then we also see in Christian traditions and in other traditions, we see a different kind of solidarity, which I'm going to call it, you probably would know better terms, but I'm going to call it the solidarity of the vulnerable. And it's the sort of thing that brings people together who are insecure in themselves, in their families. For example, peasants in May was the time of the worst in Europe, lots of parts of Europe, the worst for starvation.
Of course, yeah.
Even though it was the new crops were coming.
Yeah.
So solidarity of the insecure was, well, you had more festivals. So you could circulate your whatever there was. So there was more solid, you could say, there's a social dimension there that's quite different from charity, but maybe not totally separate from it. I don't know what you think about this, but it's because it's like there's a drive, you might say, a social drive among the vulnerable to associate with others, to be able to do something collectively they can't do otherwise. Would you say?
Yeah, of course. No, I would agree. I would say that you said a lot, but like I would say that there's definitely
he always does.
Like that, I can try and go through it. There's definitely the importance of a social factor in our approach to sort of solidarity and compassion. I think what's actually really interesting is if you look at the medieval world, there's one space which is created in that period, which actually becomes a really important space for solidarity and compassion, and that's the cemetery. Because we started to bury bodies, and we started to bury the dead and those we love we love in a specific place. And the cemetery in the medieval world is actually far more than what it is today. It's actually a place where children have festivals and there's celebrations and there's events. It's not a morbid space, but more of a sort of social space. And you mentioned like the United States, which I think is a really interesting example, particularly on compassion to certain issues. And if you look in the 17th century, I think one of the most sort of stark comparisons within the States and the Caribbean is definitely the approach to slavery. If you compare Barbados in 1625, and I believe Pennsylvania in 1681, and you look at the approach between William Penn, who's obviously a Quaker, and his religious aspect towards slavery. He frees them in 1682, I believe, if I'm not wrong. And then you have, on the other end, you have William Courtine, who is a lord from Britain, arrives in Barbados in 1625, and who decides that it's time to increase slavery, increase plantations, and of course sugar production, etc., etc. And so, I definitely think that compassion is totally conditioned by where you're living and by the society amongst who you're with. And I'd end, if you look in the 19th century, this idea of Christian solidarity, compassion even continues post the Industrial Revolution, particularly in 1847, where you have the Archbishop of Lille, he actually goes, he leaves Lille in a small town. Lille's not that big then. He marches to the head of the Second Republic and says, I've seen the factories, I've seen the industries, and I'm sick of the exploitation of man by man. And so it's that famous sentence where, definitely people are fully conditioned by where they are, and that kind of psychological aspect to compassion is very important. I hope that's answered what you said in a few words, but if you have any more points, I'm happy to take them.
Tim, do you want to come back on that, or shall we move to Richard?
Well, just briefly, I think.
Yeah, do.
Just mention. It's a question about how you put these different dimensions of history, of historical and social relations, and of the constitutive parts of people's individuality together. And someone I wondered if you'd come across, because he's based in Italy now, but worked for a long time in France, and is very interested in these questions, but starts in a way from, if you like, the objective measurements rather than the cultural signification you have. And that's a man named Emmanuel Todd, an anthropologist who's a demographer.
Right, interesting.
And he approaches these things.
Yeah.
He's very interested in kinship. He starts from family, and he's done as an anthropologist. He always focused on comparative kinship.
Yeah, interesting.
And he has
videos. He has lots of videos.
He has a presence now on YouTube and so on.
Sounds good.
TODD, and he's mainly in French, but some in English.
That's all right.
No, French is no problem from English. But the thing about him is he came to the conclusion that he's like it, and it functions like his value systems, if you like, he would express as compassionate, Western liberal, right?
Yeah.
But his sociological, anthropological method is very objectivist. So from that point of view of his social science, what he follows is what's sustainable and what's not. So he was one of the first. He's very interested in demography and about how societies can reproduce themselves.
Yeah,
which is a kind of a limiting objective test. So he wrote 30 odd years ago. He wrote a book that predicted the end of the Soviet Union 10 years before it happened, for reasons to do with the
decline in birth.
It was related to the decline in birth rate, which of course is now much more general. But that he saw that there was a sort of there were notionally values of mutual support. They weren't exactly defined as compassion, which is a more Christian term, but there were values of mutual support. But in fact, they weren't connected with how the institutions of society in such a way that they were sustainable. And then, but interestingly, 20 years later, 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, he published a book, first in French, but it's for obvious reasons subsequently been translated and published in America, predicting the end of the American empire because of the collapse of the Protestant ethic of radical individualism, which lacks compassion. And basically, again, he doesn't insist on the exact term compassion, but it lacks
links.
It lacks the links. The people are not actually adequately paying attention to the things they need to do to survive as a society.
Yeah.
Which is what you were actually
Which
saying.
you're pointing at.
You were actually towards the end. Yeah.
Richard, thank you. Should we move to Richard?
I think so.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. That was very interesting. A very good reference as well. It's great.
Okay, I wanted to come back and maybe this links to what Tim was saying about Christianity and compassion. But when I mentioned Leviticus, this this dates from about 500 BC. And there are one or two kind of instructions. So it was very much a society that was had to obey laws, and there were things like when harvesting your field, you don't harvest the corners of the field, so that some areas of your field the poor can take produce. You should not strip your vineyard bare. That's another instruction. You shouldn't take everything that you've produced on the land. You should not curse the deaf or obstruct the blind. Again, that's a very clear instruction how to behave.
Of course,
you should not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. That's very interesting, as well as to saying, what kind of attitudes should I have in society? Again, you should do no wrong to strangers in your land. Treat and love them as yourself. And that relates to when the Jews were in Egypt as well. So these kind of things. I'm not sure whether this enters as compassion or directions as to how to behave as a human being.
That's a very interesting. That's actually a very interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's definitely a mixture of both in terms of how do we behave in society to be more compassionate, but also I guess it's kind of how those rules and ideals been reinterpreted over time, which is definitely very interesting. I'm sure that there are a lot of people saying that many of the rules like this are being broken hand over foot at the moment. But all the same, at that time, 500 BC thereabouts, it's interesting to see that that this was being taught and people advised how to behave. Of course. Definitely. No, it's very interesting. It is certainly very interesting. And perhaps, our society's become far less, it's become far less collective. And so we've maybe lost those sense of sort of not unspoken rules, but, unspoken forms of solidarity, which have been slowly eroded over time. That's what I would say. But perhaps people beg to differ. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting point. Definitely.
If I could just come back in on that quickly, I think what Richard's just said, I think there's an even more general principle, not that I'm an expert on Talmudic culture, but there's an even more general principle behind the things that Richard's talking about, which you see come out in the way that Jewish culture today, as much as ever, addresses the need for atonement, to recognize for individuals, to recognize the need on a regular, and that's activated in the calendar at regular intervals, to recognize the need for excesses in individual behavior in relation to others that they need to not just regret or feel sorry about, but to try and rectify in some way. And that's like, if that's how that relates to compassion, it's not got the name, it's not got the badge of the ideal.
No.
It's part of your compassion dialectic, you might say, because it's part of a set of relations that help reproduce what compassion is an ideal of. I would think.
No, of course. No, I would definitely agree. In the sense that, totally. I would definitely agree. But I think that, I agree, definitely. I fully agree.
I want to throw a curved ball.
Sure.
There's no other questions, so I feel like a curved ball. I'm not sure.
Yes.
How much I like compassion, as I understand it. whether it's a good thing. I'm not sure how it relates to socialism.
In what
I'm
sense?
not sure that to have compassion, you don't need to have people. Compassion infers to me something that someone who's superior feels to somebody who's slightly less superior. I don't know whether this is true, but it makes me slightly uncomfortable. And I'd like to expand that. This is quite a brave thing, because I don't think it was the thing to say at all. That I stirred up a lot of trouble once by something that I wrote, and I think we can overvalue, if you like, or think too well of the sort of. I have problems. I'm not going to articulate this very well. The sort of solidarity that comes out of need. There was someone who, many years ago, Seabrook, used to sort of, Jeremy Seabrook, was it? Used to value, used to seem to me to cast in too rosy a light the solidarity that came out of, and the collectivism and the united effort that came out of deprivation, that kind of tended to cast the kind of working class people in the days when you'd have called them working class, who lived in rows of houses in back-to-back homes facing each other with no gardens or anything, and were desperately poor and shared things between them. Actually, in the way a lot of the mining communities behaved to each other during the strike, during the fight that Thatcher picked with them. And I wonder, I don't know, I'm talking before I work this through, but I feel that I wouldn't like the idea of socialism to be based on the sort of collectivism and the compassion that people show each other when they're in desperate need. And I wonder what you think about the relationships between socialism and compassion, and what you think about need and deprivation and compassion. Can we have compassion for each other without them?
I think that's a very tricky question. I think
It's a good curveball, wasn't it?
It was quite the curveball. It was a great one.
There you go.
It was a very good one. You really come out on top of that curveball, that's for sure. I think it's a very good question what you asked. Because I think that compassion is definitely part and parcel of socialism, in the sense it's those structures of helping those in need, which are defined by compassion and then enacted in socialistic policies like the welfare state, like, taking means of production as sort of a response to the idea of compassion. But does compassion exist without want or need? I mean, I think that's a very hard question, because in the sense you're right, we are compassionate because we feel that someone is lacking something. I think Adam Smith used his example of a mother and a child. The child cries, the mother is compassionate because the child wants something to eat, drink. And so, we only give that compassion when there's a need. So I think, it's definitely a very tricky question. I mean, do you think that you can have compassion without need? What would be your view? Or do you think it's only in a situation of need? Can you be compassionate for someone who doesn't necessarily need something?
I think it's something we need to thrash out. When I used to engage in this kind of philosophizing about language and about socialism and about politics, really, far more than I do now, I used to come across the problem, or whether I created it or whether it exists, I don't know, but that we don't have the words in our vocabulary to describe the sort of morals and emotions and relationships that we would like to see in a socialist society. I don't, and the kind of economics that we'd like to see. We really lack the right kind of words. And when I was doing my PhD, I used to find that I'd make up some words, but I'd often not be able to reach for them because they didn't seem to exist. So, I mean, that's a bit of a sidestep, but what worries me and what I do think is that at the moment we don't conceptualize compassion without there inferentially being a condition of need. And I think that as socialists, in an ideal socialist world, we wouldn't want people to be in need. Now, I think people could feel grief in a socialist society when somebody died. I think they could feel compassion for somebody that was ill, yeah. But that's one, and I can't define that category of need and deprivation as distinct from the sort of compassion and deprivation that comes from poverty and oppression.
Can I try and help Frankie? Hector, just to say,
Tim.
I think one of the things you can say about, I hope Hector will agree, one of the things you can say about compassion in the context I've encountered it in with different religious and cultural traditions is that always involves mutuality.
Yeah.
Right? Which charity, for example, doesn't quite, if Frankie's worried about noblesse oblige, charity is much more one directional. There's a relationship of charity, of course, but there's a giver and a receiver, whereas compassion is definitely more mutual, isn't it, Hector? And that's why it's interesting, in ways that charity is not.
Yeah.
And I think
I would agree.
Yeah.
Definitely. I would agree. Definitely. No, compassion is definitely mutual. Of course, it's not. It's definitely not a one-way street.
And so, if there are questions there about the relationship between this or that idea of socialism and compassion, it's more of, if you like, a problem for theories of socialism, because how does yes, we know different people know different aspects of this, but it's clear that there are issues about the relationship between ideas of socialism and mutuality. Cultures aren't there, and that's definitely a big issue.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And of course, compassion is definitely highly relative and depends on, everyone's culture and everyone's religion. There is definitely a sort of a compassion as a general principle, but it's definitely very defined by each person's own perception of how it functions.
Yeah. Which if you're going to have any real mutuality, you have to have that intersubjective complication. It's not just how you or I looking at it say these people are related. It's how everyone experiences it who's involved.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Richard?
Yes. Sorry. I really wanted to react to Frankie there. And I put it in the chat. I was thinking that maybe socialism really is a child of compassion. That's how socialism came about. I go some way with Frankie, questioning. Does socialism really reflect compassion? And there, I will bring up again something I mentioned earlier: the Mundi money or Mundi money, and how offensive it is to hand out these coins still once a year in prison to the poor from the monarchy.
That's right.
It really is such an offensive custom.
So where do we draw the line between the sort of giving, if you like?
You froze, Frankie.
You frozen.
Oh, that's offensiveness And
sorry, we missed it, Frankie. You froze for a moment.
did I? Oh
Yeah.
dear. Okay. I'm keen to get on to Helen, but I'm going to ask very quickly, go
Yeah.
on to what Richard said. And
Sure.
where do we draw the line then between?
Well,
sorry, I was going to say, I think it's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult as well, but I would say that the line should really, I mean, perhaps maybe the line can be drawn on necessity then, in the sense that compassion should be really something that which is really for those who are most in need. No, in the sense that from a definition point of view, if it becomes too generalized, it loses its meaning of first and foremost helping those who most require it.
Well, let me bring up a recent political problem where when the Labour government wanted to reform the benefit system,
Yeah.
And they were impeded from doing this by the PLP in protest. So,
Yeah.
is it right to reform the benefit system? Are there that many people who are abusing the benefit system? Does it discourage actually going out to contribute to society, to work, to study, or whatever? Or is it right to have a very strong benefit system? I think all these questions where one draws a line is a debate.
Of course.
There isn't a line in the sand.
Of course. No, definitely. It's very hard to find, definitely. Oh, no, I would totally agree.
I want.
But should we maybe move to Helen and then Tracy?
Yes, thank you.
Let's do that. We'll pass around because there's a lot of questions.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I also missed your talk, Hector. So I do apologize if what I'm about to say
that's totally fine.
Already covered. I'm going to shift this a bit here and hope it's relevant. I'm looking at things through fairly contemporary, through the prism of America, and I'm thinking about things like Occupy Wall Street and you know, various movements like that where people have come together, as far as I'm aware, out of a kind of politics of compassion to basically you know, to basically kind of protest against what they see as the oppressor.
Unjust.
And see it as unjust. And I'm thinking about memes that are around. You know, there's things like radicalized by basic decency is a meme in America, and David Byrne talked about kindness being one of the most subversive gestures at the moment. And I'm just curious to think, isn't this relevant here? That actually there is a collective that wants to run, you know, we could put compassion and empathy to one side, that just wants to run on basic kindness and support for one another. So it's that collective support. Now I don't know, that might be a really mundane point, but as you've been talking, I've been thinking,
I think it's a fair point.
You know, there are really, well, yeah, I do too, and I think there is a potential collective there that really wants to do this, and that's one of the reasons I came here, because I thought, I really want to find out about this. Because
I would say I agree. I think you've actually raised a really important point, which is that sometimes we forget the most basic things, and that actually, you know, although this is a discussion had in the context of a political party, I think we should all, you know, we can all agree that most people have compassion, whether, you know, there is that basic level of decency, which is important. And there are those which seek to use that to change things, as you said, in America. And so, I think it's really important that if you want to restore compassion to politics, perhaps you should also restore compassion just to our personal relationships and just our relationships, just, you know, on a day-to-day basis of being compassionate is also important, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and just to come back and then I'll let Tracy, you know, but there's also a collective spirit there that wants to do this.
Of course.
You know, and that needs somehow to be kind of, you know, propagated, really.
Yeah, of course. No, definitely. I would definitely agree. Yeah, it's a really fair point and a really interesting one. So thank you very much.
Tracy.
Tracy?
Thank you. It was fantastic. I really enjoyed this discussion, this whole discussion. I wanted to pick on what Richard was talking about the welfare system and whether there were people, and I think the there are great problems with the current welfare system. I think
Right.
that was seen, and why I couldn't respond in the end, even though I'm technically the disabilities officer, I couldn't respond to the send because to me that the whole thing generated around saving money on the one hand and helping children with the other, and the the clashing of those two principles, trying to get those two things in sync, don't work. They couldn't make it work to me. Um, and I totally failed to get a grip on it because I just couldn't find anywhere to get a grip on it. And so I want to apologize for that. But I think that's the place to start, where Helen was talking about. The place to start has to be decency and creating decency back into society, surely. Decency and compassion go hand in hand, don't they?
I'm not sure, but go on. Yeah.
You're not sure. You see, I mean, to me, if we all have, and I think it's not true that we all have actually. I've started in my old age to believe in evil, um, but if you believe that most people have a common sense of compassion and a
Yeah.
common sense of decency,
Yeah.
how does a political party use that to advance policies that are aimed at equality? I would say that using decency and compassion to create what Frankie is talking about, which I think at the end of the day is equality.
That's right.
Because we don't get to equality by fighting. We don't get anywhere by fighting. Oh, you've only got to look at Iran and bloody Donald Trump at the moment to see that. I think I'm going to be arrested any minute. But you know, we don't get there by that. We have to get there by other means.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm
That's right.
wondering about that.
I'm thinking, Tracy, that the words you've used are very, very good because I've actually got written down on a piece of paper here that sprang out of actually what Helen said, but that you've used
It
words
was very
for.
good.
And that is decency and equality and I wanted to add into that respect because I think
Yeah.
what I want, is people to respect each other. I think
Yeah,
I
of
want
course.
people to treat each other decently, and I
Yeah.
think I want equality.
Yeah.
I'm very uncomfortable with compassion. And what I was going to suggest was in my kind of linguistic phase that I'd put kind of three tiers, and the top tier, the really ideal, I'd have respect and I'd have decency and I'd have equality. And in the kind of middle, I'd have compassion because it's sort of not 100% good to me because it infers some sort of inequality. I think what I said earlier about
Yeah.
words, and I
Yeah.
think that when it comes in a socialist society, say somebody being ill, that
Yeah.
would be sympathy. So I'm happy about sympathy, and I'm
But not
happy
compassion.
about equality, and I'm happy about decency, and I'm happy about respect. And they're all words that I like. They have a positivity about them.
But not compassion.
Compassion, I'm not sure about this, guys.
Interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting point. Is there a
Mary
question?
Kane,
Mary?
did you put your hand up?
How do I get into the system?
You're in it.
I'm
you're
in
in
it.
it.
Okay, you
Off
can
you
hear
go.
me. I've just been really suffering, really, except that I thought Hector's talk was brilliant. Thank you very much. That was really super stuff.
That's right.
But
No
I've got a
worries.
real problem with the word compassion. What's the word? Compassion. No, because it's just patronising. It can't be anything else. If you're on the receiving end of it, it's bloody awful, I have to tell you. So everyone's dropping from the language as far as I'm concerned. We need to think of other ways of expressing this.
Interesting.
Can I come in
Fair
on?
That's
Hello.
two people
Can
who
I
are
come
not.
in on the opposite? I
You
hate to
can, but I mean, that's two people we've got. It's very interesting. Two people that are not happy about compassion at all. I'm
I
not
pref-
happy
can I
about it.
come in,
Mary isn't, and Tim, you
weigh
come
in
in
on the
now.
other side?
Mm.
And I think that I hate to disagree with Mary, and I think I understand what she's talking about, or with you, Frankie, but I think compassion is a much more interesting term. Now, I appreciate all the terms we're using are going to mean different things to different people, depending on how we've acquired them in our upbringing. One of the things I see in compassion, the way that Hector's developed the discussion of it, is there's a degree of respect for difference in it. Which for me overrides any problems overrides problems about patronizing presumption. And I think that's one thing that's you get extra with if you were going to try and unpack it as a concept that things can be done with and have been done with historically, as Hector's exploring. One of the extras is in that direction. And there's more emotional engagement at the same time as more respect for difference. Or less presumption. Because one of the big problems about all the stuff to do with, which you start to get into around the normal bourgeois discourse, even like post-French revolutionary discourse about equality, mutual responsibility, legal law, and all this sort of thing, is that the presumption is much too much that everybody has to be like everybody else. The model of being is too restricted. And that's recognized legally or culturally recognized as too restrictive. Whereas compassion, I'm not saying it has all the answers, but it stretches historically. It stretched the envelope a bit, and there's an explicit commitment in it to be able
to recognize
to share feelings with people who you recognize are in a different situation from yourself. And that's not necessarily patronizing at all.
No.
I feel compassion for Elon Musk. He's got a lot more money in the bank than I do.
Fair enough. I mean, each their own. But no, I can definitely see what you mean. I think that, the term compassion perhaps gives a certain, it allows for sort of a degree of difference, which maybe equality erodes that degree in some ways. Maybe.
Yep.
Mary?
I don't think you want to be on the receiving end of compassion. What you want is respect and empathy.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Compassion's horrible. Fundamentally patronizing, basically.
Well, Mary, this is Richard. I put it on the chat. I agree. I was adding empathy to Frankie's list of words there. So I think you're quite right.
Interesting. I mean, I think it's a very interesting question to be asked. I would say compassion is not that patronizing, but
you want to be on the receiving end of it, and then you know it is very patronizing.
I think one has to remember that Hector is writing, as was clear from his talk, in the context of, especially of French political and cultural history.
French.
It was a brilliant talk. I enjoyed everything.
And some of the things that Hector said, one could argue with different points of, as any grand historical account about this and that. But the things that Hector said about how notions of compassion arguably entered into French legislative debates and reforms at 100 years or 120 years ago are absolutely fantastic.
And I would say what's interesting as well is if you look at history in terms of across different cultures, it's very hard to find respect and empathy in terms of just a historical term, whereas compassion is that one word which does cross both. I mean, obviously this is more focused on Europe, but the word compassion does cross both Byzantine Europe, Islamic Europe, and Christian Europe as a term, whereas respect is a term which emerges a lot later linguistically than the word compassion. But Tracy?
I was just going to say that I think without compassion, I can't see where we would be. I think compassion is a necessary part of the human psyche. I don't know about being on the receiving end of it. But I think it's a damn sight better than being on the receiving end of no compassion. I mean, I don't know. So I doss my cap to those who maybe have been on the receiving side of it and not found it a positive experience. But I would have thought that somebody being on the receiving end of somebody with no compassion, it is equally bad.
Of
I
course, yeah.
mean, we're arguing about the pedantics of a word at the end of the day. Are we arguing about the meaning of the word, or are we arguing about the what it means for a society or what it means for an individual? I mean, we surely must have compassion for what's going on in Gaza. I mean, we
Of course.
must have compassion for those people.
Yeah.
They're not lesser people than me. They're just normal people like me trying to live their life who've suddenly had their whole world turned upside down by their neighbor. And I have a certain compassion for that because I have a terrible neighbor on a much lower scale who doesn't bomb me on a regular basis, but he is a complete and absolute horror to live beside. And you
Yeah.
know, compassion. I think life with a world without compassion would be very, very hard to live in.
Yeah. No, of course. I would definitely agree with that. Totally. I would fully agree. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't have much more to add to that, but yeah, I would definitely agree
And
with
I,
what
I
you said.
like the idea of as well that compassion unites the religions.
Yeah, I mean, well, it unites different cultural spheres and areas, whereas the
Yes.
term respect is a bit hard to find in terms of just sources. But
And
yeah,
let's go for words that unite.
yeah,
Let's use words that unite us
that's true.
across different races
Cultures.
and different cultures,
Yeah,
because we need that more than ever at the moment, because there is now such a group of people out there who want to put walls between cultures, who find that advantageous to their own
yeah,
lifestyles, and we
yeah,
need to break down those
of
walls.
course. Yeah,
And if this is the language that breaks them down, let's use it.
of
How
course.
do you feel
Yeah.
about that, Frankie? Tell me how you feel about that. Take your thing off.
Well, let me respond because I've just, Richard, I just, I'm sort of asking myself the question: are we getting a little sort of a problem with language here? Because I can understand the need for a compassionate society, but I can't. I'm dubious about the emotion of compassion as pity. Pitying people. So I've got this idea of, okay, we a compassionate society, one that looks out for one's neighbor, etc.
Yeah.
But I don't want to live in a society that where people pity one another in that sense of. And there I come close to what Mary was saying earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Yes, Frankie.
I think a debate about compassion, compassion and socialism or compassion and equality, something like along those lines might be quite interesting to continue with.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's very interesting. I greatly appreciated, and I hope it doesn't sound as if I didn't, Hector's presentation.
Yeah.
And what the positive things I got out of it were this appreciation, if you like, of how ideas that are related to compassion have changed and
Yeah.
have affected different kind of political expressions of
Yeah.
political ideas.
Yeah. No.
And I liked this patterning of and almost kind of wanted a kind of sequencing.
Yeah.
So you've got kind of like compassion here, and then you've got a change in people's ideology or ideas, if you like. And
Yeah.
you've got a kind of a thing in, that then you've got something that's to do with policy,
Yeah. No.
welfare, or,
Yeah.
or having a corner of the field that wasn't
No.
ploughed, or
Cloud.
having whatever.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of going through history kind of like in,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah.
10, 15, 20-year blocks or whatever,
No.
and
No.
doing that kind of parallel thing. But
Yeah.
I do think also that it might be very interesting to think about why respect is lacking
Yeah. I
in
mean,
your research.
what I would say would be that maybe we could do another event.
Mm.
And maybe what might be more interesting is if people are interested in socialism and politics, to have sort of to rediscuss the ideas of compassion, but looking very specifically in the 19th century, where you have the emergence of socialism and sort of pre-welfare states in Europe, and maybe kind of have more of a deep dive into the 19th century and the emergence of socialism. To just because I think like that context, the 19th century overall, provides a lot more insights into how that notion of compassion emerges. It's just a thought.
No, I think that's quite good. I mean, perhaps we need some sort of compassion in order to motivate people
Yeah.
towards socialist ideas.
Yeah.
But what we want to see within socialist relationships are positive things like the words we've come up with, like respect and empathy,
Yeah.
and not what I say middle tier words like compassion, which I think got elements of problematics in them. Can we go to Helen?
Yes.
Helen?
Thank
Helen?
you. Thanks. I think in 2026, it's actually quite important to define your terminology because the meanings of words are constantly being changed. So I think it's really good that you're having this conversation.
Yeah.
But I mean, and I think it would be really interesting to have a debate around around 19th century. But I also think we shouldn't forget that we are living through some sort of revolution of technology at the moment, and that is going to have a big impact on the way we interact with each other. And I think it would be really good to do it through the prism of what's of the contemporary
current world.
situation.
Do you mean like in terms of the prism of the current world?
Yeah, I'm thinking we're going through something through technology that is as revolutionary as the Industrial Revolution was, and we've been doing that since the 1990s, and it's changed the way we engage and the way we engage with each other and the way we engage, generally
Of course.
through well, we're on this call now. And I just wonder whether it wouldn't be really interesting, or if you had a respondent or, if we could think about it from that perspective, because I think,
You mean from the current world perspective?
Yes. Yeah. So look at the emergence of socialism, because, at the moment, socialism is seen as irrelevant and,
yeah.
And that really, it would be very helpful if that changed. Obviously, we're all on this call for that reason. But I'm just thinking if there was a way of
linking the two together.
Yeah, I think so. I think that would make for.
I think we could. I mean, yeah, I think it's difficult because there's like a lot of things which I guess would be nice to talk about, and it's kind of linking them together, which is always a horrible thing when you're doing history. Is how to like link different
I understand you're a historian, and I'm a I don't know what I am actually. I'm
no, but like I think that it'll be interesting to kind of maybe do more of a deep dive into sort of compassion and compare maybe the Industrial Revolution with the technological revolution post 1990. That could be quite an interesting to sort of compare both periods.
Well, if it might not, I'm not asking. You might not want to take it on, but I'm
happy to, honestly. I'm very happy to.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
If there's the demand, I'm happy to take it on. It's no worries, especially the 19th century, because it's quite it's sort of what I've done this whole year. So the 19th century is totally fine, and I'm happy to link it post kind of 1990, etc. But yeah, I'm happy to, if people want something.
I don't know if anyone else wants
to
that, but
continue this onwards.
I just think it's really important that we're bringing this back into the contemporary context, because we're living in really, in quite a critical time, and if we're not careful, we could end up living in a state or a set of states that we don't want to be in.
I think that's correct. I think that we've been very
Can I just come back?
Yeah, I mean,
oh,
go
sorry.
on. Go on.
I just want to pick up on something that Helen said that made me think. It's a little bit aside, but you talked about technology, and suddenly I came to mind the problem of social media and children, young people, who seemingly become almost dehumanized in the way they're treating their their companions or whatever of their same age, and I think Helen sort of touched on something there, although this is slightly aside from studying contemporary technology, how it's affecting social.
No, I agree. No, they're very interesting points to dive deeper into, definitely. And I'm happy to take it on if people want.
Do people want to feed anything else into? Well, Hector's expressed a willingness
Yeah,
to go
I'm happy to
forward
answer
with this and to take these ideas forward. Do people have anything?
I would also say, if
Yeah.
I could, what might also be interesting would be to also look at compassion, but in a non-Western sense. And this is looking at how it's evolved historically in, say, China, and particularly Australia Aboriginal societies, Maori societies, certain parts of Africa, Ethiopia, and kind of, because often in these discussions we focus a lot about the West, and we look at people like Attlee and the welfare state, and people like Mamdani, who are all very Western figures, and it might be interesting to have a more non-Western approach, but that's just a proposition.
That's a very good point. I think that's very interesting how societies have evolved outside of European evolution.
Yeah, no, it could be very interesting to look at that kind of comparison. And so, I mean, I don't mind, but maybe, I mean, I'm happy to take it on. There's no worries on that front. It might have to be maybe two more, like a series, because I was thinking in one dense session. So what we could do is this is just a thought off the top of my head now. We could do the next one being kind of compassion that's not in the West, so non-Western compassion, and then that will lead us from kind of the age of empire, the 19th century, into kind of the comparison of the 19th and 20th centuries. So a 3-part continuation of this, but I'm very happy to do it, no worries.